what happens? Is this a time where big companies, as they look back right now, if they look back 3 or 4 years in the future, is this when they're getting disrupted? Or is this where, when the bigger companies or even the startups, is this where they really buckle down and figure it out right now? Historically, what's happened?
Can I give a hypothesis for Mark to shut down if this is wrong? But the reason why I wanted to talk about the capitalist dilemma is that, in fact, there is capital everywhere. And the cost of capital is, I mean, everybody would say that our return to capital is 15% or whatever. That's what we aspire to. The reality is the return to venture capital over the last 10 years overall has been nearly zero. And yet you've got all of this capital, you know? And so it creates behavior that you just wouldn't imagine. And the reason I wanted to talk about how there used to be abundance of bandwidth, and so you could waste bandwidth, I wonder if capital is doing the same thing to investment. And that is, it's a time when we shouldn't husband the use of capital, but be aggressively putting the capital to work. But that also then drives up the value of the investments that we're putting our money into. I don't know.
I think that's right. So I think we can talk about what's happening specifically in the Valley, but there is a broader point that Clay's bringing up, which I think is important to understand, which is we all want to talk about tech and we all want to talk about venture capital, but the total amount of money going into all the tech companies, all the unicorns, is on the order of $50 billion a year, which is a large amount of money from an absolute standpoint, right, in terms of just how we think about money day to day. It's a very, very small amount of money from a global context. And so I'll just give you one example of how to think about that, two examples how to think about that. So one is about $50 billion going into high tech. This year alone, more than $1 trillion will be distributed from just the U.S.'s 500 biggest companies. Just the S&P 500 will distribute more than $1 trillion of cash back to their shareholders, right? Which is, so those of you who are math majors, 20 times more money is going to come out of big established companies than is going to go into startups, right? And so to me, the real question, the macro question, is not what happens with the 50 billion that goes into startups. The real question is what happens to the 950 billion that doesn't, and where does that go? The other macro fact that you can look at that helps explain this, I think, is, right, globally there's a lot more money in debt than there is in equity. Global bond markets are much, much bigger than the global equity markets. Globally, there's $6 trillion of bonds globally that are returning negative yield. And so there's $6 trillion worth of money in financial instruments in the world where you have to pay for the privilege of owning them, right? You not only don't get any money, you have to pay to own them, right? And again, I just compare 50 billion into startups versus 6 trillion where you have to pay to own a bond. And so I think the critical crisis in the economy at large is not that the unicorns are overvalued. The critical crisis in the economy at large is that there aren't enough unicorns. And then to Clay's point, big companies, I totally agree with him, are not being nearly aggressive enough in investing for the future, because what the markets are telling us is, exactly to your point, capital is abundant, opportunity is scarce.